Hi everybody. Today I am going to be doing one of my favorite recipes. I do it every year and it's really simple, but it's also something that people think is really difficult to do, and that's making a pumpkin pie from scratch. Totally from scratch. So today I'm going to be showing you how to make the dough from scratch, how to cook your pumpkin, and then how to take your cooked pumpkin and turn it into a pie. I am going to be following these recipe sheets that I have created, and you should be able to access these in a link below the video. These will tell you all of the ingredients, all of the steps that I'm going to go through, and they will also tell you all of the equipment that you're going to need if you want to do it the same way that I'm going to do it. As I'm making it, I will tell you some substitutions if you don't have all of the equipment, but that'll be a nice, easy guide for you guys. So let's get started. First thing you want to do is mix out your flour. It's only going to be 2 cups of flour. I like to do it over my bowl so that way if there is a little bit extra, it's not going to hurt anything and it saves on cleanup a little bit. You don't want a whole bunch, so if it looks like you accidentally pour a cup of excess flour in the bottom of your bowl, you're going to want to empty it out. But we're just going to put that in there. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to add half of the shortening and half of the butter. We're going to split this up and do it in 2 chunks. So to start with, we're going to be putting in the shortening. We're only going to add half of this, so it doesn't matter what kind of measuring cup you're using. Whatever it is, you're just going to put half of it in there. You can scoop out half or however. But then I'm just going to slice off half of that and put it in there. And then, so that was 2/3 of a cup of shortening or lard, and then 2 tablespoons of butter. So that means I'm going to start off with just 1 tablespoon. And then what you're going to do is at this point you're going to either use a fork, or this is called a pastry blender. I didn't know what this was until like 5 years ago, and it has saved my life in cooking so many times. So I highly recommend finding one of these guys. They're really cheap at a kitchen store and they're really, really handy. But otherwise you can just use a fork. And we're just going to mix all of the ingredients together until they're just well mixed. So what this pastry blender is doing, same thing that your fork would be doing. It's just a little bit easier to handle. But it's just gently mixing the moisture of the butter and the shortening in with your flour. And you're supposed to mix it until it's about cornmeal consistency. But really, you can kind of tell when it's mixed together. You just want to make sure that you don't have those big chunks of butter and shortening laying around. And then when you think that you've got it a pretty good consistency, you're just going to add in the rest of your butter and your shortening and keep going. Let's see here. So like there's a big chunk of butter right there. The colder it is, the better it's going to be, but at the same time it's also going to be harder to get it mixed in there. So this is just part of one of those things that makes homemade stuff taste a little bit better. It's the elbow grease. It's the secret ingredient, right up there with love. Alright, I think this is looking pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and add in my butter. And the other half of my shortening. And then, nope. I'm also going to be adding in my salt here before it gets too mixed. It's a good idea to actually add in the salt at the very beginning when you just have the flour. But if you do it before it's completely mixed, it should be okay. You just don't want to over mix it. And it just calls for a teaspoon of salt. Alright, I think this is looking to be a pretty good consistency here. Looks like it's all mixed together. So the last thing that you're going to want to do is you're going to want to add your water. What I usually do is I have a cup of water sitting next to me. And again, the colder the water, the better. I wouldn't put ice in it, but otherwise the colder the water is going to be good. And you're just going to take 1 tablespoon at a time and drizzle it over the top and then mix it in. So depending on how well it's mixed and the room temperature of your butter and things, you might not use all the tablespoons. You can use up to 5. At this point, I'm gonna go ahead and take my pastry blender out, and I'm going to use my hands to mix it from here on out. You gotta be careful because your hands are hot. So once you start mixing it with your hands, you're not gonna wanna handle it very much. I'm gonna go ahead and sprinkle a little more water. I wouldn't add a whole lot more to this because it's pretty doughy. So you can see that it is easily forming a ball. It's not a very pretty ball, but it is a ball. And that is what you want. So actually, I think I might have added a little bit too much water, but that'll be okay. So it's, like I said, it's not gonna be a very pretty ball, but you just roll it up into a ball, and you're going to then set this in the refrigerator, cover it, and cover it overnight for your best results. And then you will, we'll talk about how you roll it out and get it ready for your actual pie in the next step. But right now, making of your pie crust is done. Alright, so now that we have our pie crust made, we can move on to the next step in our recipe, and that is cooking our pumpkin. People are often really intimidated at the thought of cooking a pumpkin, but really it's super duper easy. If you've ever carved a pumpkin, you can definitely bake a pumpkin. It's a lot easier than that. And once you taste the difference and see how easy it is, you'll never go back to the canned stuff. When you do have to have a special kind of pumpkin. They're called pie pumpkins, or sometimes they're called sugar pumpkins. They're a lot smaller, as you can see. You can usually find them in the store right alongside the jack-o'-lantern pumpkins in the produce department. The difference is that these are a lot sweeter, and they're gonna make that's what makes the pie so flavorful. All right, so First thing you're going to do with your pumpkin is you're just going to cut it in half. So you're going to want to be careful, but you're just going to want to take a sharp, sturdy knife and cut it in half. Usually, they're not that difficult. If you have a large stem on the top, you might want to pull that off. This is a nice little stem, so I'm not going to worry about it. If it's not cut exactly in half, that's going to be okay too. And then you're just going to have half of a pumpkin here. Just like when you carve a pumpkin, the next step is going to be scooping out the seeds. This time though, since it's cut in half, it's a lot easier, and you don't need to worry about saving the seeds or anything like that. So it can be a little messy, but you just want to get the seeds out. If there's a little bit of this stringy stuff, that's not going to hurt anything. When it's fully cooked, it'll just slide right off, or it'll just mush in with everything else. So then I'm going to put that in my baking pan and do the other half. It's not going to hurt to leave the stem on, but it's just kind of annoying. The other thing you're going to want to do before you get started is you're going to want to preheat your oven to 350 degrees. That is what we're going to be roasting these pumpkins at. This little guy here actually has quite a few seeds. I'm a little surprised. And again, if it's not perfect, that's okay. Once it bakes, it'll all come apart. But here we go. It's empty. So I'm just going to put the seeds aside. We're not going to do anything with those. You do want to poke some holes in the top of your pumpkin. It doesn't have to be a lot. They don't have to be very big. But this is just so that while it's baking, the steam that is cooking it will be able to escape through the top, and it'll cook through a lot faster. Again, you're going to want to be very careful not to cut your fingers. With this step, if you want to use a smaller knife, that would probably be a good idea. It'll work just the same. There we go. And then an optional step you can do is you can brush the pumpkin and the insides with some oil, like some olive oil or some vegetable oil. I don't usually do that just because it's an extra step, but it does bring up the flavor a little bit if you choose to do that. But what I do make sure to do is pour a little bit of water in the bottom of the pan. Now you don't want a lot, you want just enough to cover the bottom. And again, this is going to help steam the pumpkin as well as bake it, and then that's going to push through the ventilation there, and you're going to have a nice soft roasted pumpkin for your pumpkin pie. Alright, the last step, now that we've got all this part done, is just to stick it in our preheated oven. Again, that is 350 degrees. And once you put it in the oven, you're going to let it sit in there for about 45 minutes. You will test it with a fork or something, or a butter knife or something like that, and you'll know that it's done because right now it's definitely very firm. When you test it with the fork or your butter knife, it's going to be very soft and mushy, kind of like a baked potato. So that's going to be what you're looking for. If it's not quite done after the 45 minutes, I would just leave it in there for another 5 minutes, take it out, test it again, and keep doing that until it's done. But 45 minutes should be just about the right time. Alright, let's put it in the oven. pumpkin is baking and our dough has been chilled, the next step is going to be rolling it out and putting it in the pie plate. And I'm not gonna lie, this is probably the hardest step of the entire process. For some, for me at least. Now, the dough that we made should be enough for two pies. So we're gonna split it in half. You're gonna want a lightly floured surface. Mine is a little medium floured, but that's okay. And you're just going to set your dough in the middle. Mine's a little crumbly. Sometimes that happens. But anyway, you're just going to roll it out. You want to roll it out so that it is, oh, I forgot, you want to put flour on your rolling pin as well. But you're going to want to roll it out to be about 1/8 of an inch thick. So, when doing things like this, you always want to have a little container of flour sitting nearby because that way it makes it easier to reflour. I do know one thing that you want to be careful of is you don't want to over handle the dough. Because just like when we were making the pie crust, you want to keep it cool. And so when you overwork it with your hands, it heats up the dough and then you're going to have problems, especially when it's really crumbly like mine is. You're going to take your pie plate. You're going to want it to be about 2 inches past your pie plate. Now, crumbly could mean that you have too much flour. It could mean that you don't have enough water. There's a lot of things that it could mean. So ideally, what you're gonna do is you're going to roll this onto your rolling pin. I think mine is going to be too crumbly to do this. And then you'll roll it up and transfer it over to your pie. Now, when mine is too crumbly to do this, sometimes I will get a spatula or a butter knife to help me get it up off of the thing. What I'm doing is I am just getting some air underneath of it, so that way it'll come off of the mat a little easier. And again, this is another thing that your room temperature, your cold dough is going to be better, because once it gets warm, it becomes a little bit more gooey. And it's gonna break even more. You might have some cracks along the way, but we can always fix those. Again, mine is very, very crumbly. Hopefully yours is not, but you'll just pick it up, move it over to your pie plate, And in theory, you will unroll it. Beautiful! I've told you guys, this is not where I shine, but there are ways then to fix this. So the idea is that you want to get as much as you can that is going to be flat into your pie plate. And then I kind of puzzle piece it together. The reason that you don't just want to stick it in here and pat it down is because it's not going to be very uniform. And so then you're going to have pockets where it's really thick and pockets where it's really thin. And that's not going to make for a good tasting pie. And this is for any pie that you're going to be making. I mean, this is not just for pumpkin pies. It does seem like it's a lot of extra work, but if you've ever had homemade pie crust, you know that it's worth it. I don't know. I bought in store-bought Pillsbury, their roll-out stuff, and it can be this big of a pain too, because you still have to roll it out and stick it in your pie plate, and I think it tastes absolutely terrible. There are some frozen pie doughs that you can buy that taste pretty good. And those are kind of worth it because it does save you this trouble here. But overall, nothing beats the taste of a homemade pie crust. And unless you're entering it in a pie contest, nobody's going to care what the bottom of your pie looks like. They are going to care if they get a big chunk of something, like a real thick piece of dough, but they're not going to care if it's smooth and all and pretty looking. They are, and this is a deep pie plate. I recommend using a deep pie plate when it comes to making pumpkin pie, just because you get more filling that way, but you certainly don't have to. So I'm going to call this good enough for the inside. Obviously we don't have a crust right now because it all fell apart. So I'm going to just go back over to, I want to make sure that I save some because we're going to be doing something else with it later to make it pretty. But I'm just going to try and roll it out if I can, which I don't think I'm going to be able to because it is too crumbly. And it gets crumblier the more that I work with it. But ideally you'd roll it out into a worm and then bring it over here. So to make your pie crust, they're really pretty, we're going to pretend that I have a nice pie crust up top here. But what you're going to do to get that nice crimped look is you're going to put one finger down, and then the next finger you're just going to pinch it. And that gives it that little crimped look. And then you go to the next spot, you're going to put your finger back over the hill, and then you're just going to pinch them together, and you're going to move on to the next spot. Where my pie crust is so crumbly, it's probably not going to matter because it's probably going to fall apart after it bakes anyway. But if you want that really pretty crimped edge, that's what you do. All right, so now our pie crust is done. We've got our nice little crimped edges. You do not have to poke holes or anything in the bottom. We'll just put this baby in the refrigerator, let it cool down a little bit, and then after we make our filling, we'll add it there before we bake it. All right, this last step is entirely optional, but it's a really fun little addition that you can do on top of the pie. And you can do this with any kind of pie that you want. And that's to roll out your extra pie dough and use cookie cutters to make some fun shapes. And then before you bake it, you'll set it on top. And I'll show you what that looks like later. But first I'm going to reflour. So I'm going to use my cookie cutter here, and this cookie cutter, I'm going to just give a shout out, was made on our 3D printer here in our Pixel Lab. You're going to take your pie crust that is in the pan and also put it in the fridge and just keep it chill until you are ready to put the filling into it. Okay, now that we've done all of the prep work, we're ready to actually mix our pie together. This is the fun part. First thing that we're going to do is we're going to scoop out the pumpkin. When your pumpkin is done, it should look a little something like this. I've let it cool. I would let it cool for at least an hour, otherwise you might burn yourself when handling the pumpkin. But you can see, you stick it with a fork, it's very easy to mush. And as we're scooping it out, you can use a spoon or a fork or whatever works best for you, but it's going to scoop out pretty easily. And we're just separating the inside of the pumpkin from the rind. Just going to discard this. All right. You can kind of mush it together a little bit if you want to, but we'll just set that aside because now we're going to mix the filling together. And like I said, we need 2 cups of our pumpkin. And then the next thing you're going to do is you're going to add a can of evaporated milk. The next thing will be the eggs. It calls for 2 eggs, and it calls for them to be lightly beaten. Lightly beaten. And that's what I've got. I've just took my 2 eggs and briefly hit them with a whisk. Okay. I'm going to gently put them in there. And then the 3/4 of a cup packed brown sugar. So Alright, so next we're going to add all of our spices. So you can buy, it's called a pumpkin pie spice, and it's got all of this stuff mixed together. But, as with everything, if you make it from scratch, it's going to taste better. That's kind of my philosophy for everything when it comes to, especially when it comes to baking the pumpkin pie. The more things that you can put together from scratch, the better it's going to taste. But it's going to be 1/2 of a teaspoon of cinnamon. The next one is going to be the ginger, and it is also going to be 1/2 of a teaspoon. We have the nutmeg, and this is also going to be 1/2 teaspoon. This stuff smells and tastes pretty wonderful, so And finally, the cloves. I would also say that the cloves is kind of an optional. Several recipes I was looking at do not call for the cloves anymore, but I really like it, so I always add it, but it's a much smaller portion. I don't even have 1/8 of a teaspoon on here, so I'm using my 1/4 of a teaspoon, and I'm just putting in about half. All right, up next, we are going to mix this thing together. I'm going to be using, it's called an immersion blender, and this thing, yes, this particular one is a lightsaber because that's how I roll. But this thing is an alternative to a blender or a food processor. And the way it works, instead of taking all of your stuff and pouring it into the blender or into the food processor, this actually will go into your bowl and it will chop everything up and mix it all together. And it is like amazing. I didn't know what this was until 2 years ago, and now I have 2 of them because they are just that amazing. So if you like to make cream soups or things with pumpkin or anything that you would normally like put into a food processor or a blender, I highly recommend. These are really cheap. They're only like $15. Invest in getting, it's called an immersion blender. But okay, here we go. We're gonna just mix this together. Okay, you'll know that your mix is done when you don't see any chunks of pumpkin anymore. It's gonna be soupy, so that is totally normal. Like, you might think that it's supposed to be a real thick soup, but it's not. It's gonna be really runny. So then you're just going to pour this into your pie plate. If you see some chunks of pumpkin that you missed that are real chunky, just pull them out with your fork. Thought I saw a couple coming here, but maybe not. Yeah, there we go. There's still plenty of pumpkin to go around. If it's a lot, then you're gonna have a mess on your hands, because I'm gonna recommend that you pour it back into the thing and remix it. But, all right, so this is what it looks like. At this point, you can take it and bake it if you want to. We made up these little embellishments earlier, and like I said, they're a little tricky to do because it is soupy, but you're just going to gently lay it on top, and it should float. Alternately, if you want to, you can bake it for about 15 minutes and let it get solid, and then come put these on there. So now you're going to put it in your oven, which you should have preheated to 450 degrees. And at that point, you're going to let it sit in the oven for 40 minutes. Or until you stick a butter knife into it and it comes out clean. All right, we'll see you, well, not in 40 minutes, but we'll see you when the pie is done. All right, our pie is now done. My pie turned out a little crispy. As you can see, the crust was a little flaky, which we knew when I was rolling it out, and it got a little burnt on the edges. There are a lot of different things that you can do to prevent that. You can put some tin foil around the edges and then take it off about halfway through. You can buy pie baking shields that go over as well. Or I just don't care, because the stuff underneath is going to be golden brown and it's going to taste delicious, and that's really the most important part. So even if it's not the prettiest, that's okay. It's still going to taste delicious, and that is the most important part. Baking is fun. Don't stress if it doesn't turn out like Martha Stewart's, okay? But here we go. This is a nice good look at my pie. And you can see that the things turned out beautiful. So I'm just gonna cut me a slice. I did let this cool. You're gonna wanna let it cool before you serve it, at least a little bit. So, there we go. Oh yeah, look at that. Didn't stay all together on my plate, but it stayed together in the pan. So that's a good consistency for a pie. I've been in a lot of pie competitions actually. Is that it's not gooey and it's not filling in that space. And then the most important thing, doesn't matter how it looks, doesn't matter how it comes out of there, it matters how it tastes. Yep, that's homemade pumpkin pie. Worth every single step. I recommend you try it at home. Hopefully you do.